Welcome to the Language Alchemy Podcast, where we transform how you communicate to have meaningful relationships at home and at work. I'm your host, Alejandra Siroca, and I help multicultural individuals, couples, and change makers beyond surface level politeness and conflict avoidance to have authentic, value-based interactions that resolve issues and deepen connection. If you're tired of rehashing conversations in your head, walking on eggshells, or feeling misunderstood in your most important relationships, this podcast will give you a new way forward. And if you've been thinking about getting support with your communication, visit languagealchemy.com to find out which transformative communication program is most beneficial for you. In the previous episode, we explored the immigrant experience and the invisible effort of communication, what it costs day after day to navigate a language and culture that's different from the one during your first years of life. Today, in the third episode of the Multicultural Communication and Belonging series, we are going to go deeper. We are going to explore how the language and culture we grew up with shape everything about how we communicate. And I'm not just talking about the words we use, but the way we think, the way we structure our ideas, the way we see who is responsible for what, and even what to talk about, when to talk about it, and how to do it. And you are going to discover something very important about your communication that might surprise you or that you may have not taken into account until now. I think I shared with you in a previous episode, and I also wrote about this in my book that's coming out in November, that when I was a university student, one of my linguistic professors asked our class to bring in definitions of language. And we all did. We all brought and read out loud lofty academic definitions from well-known linguists. They were the kind of definitions that look very impressive on a textbook, with lots of multisyllabic words. Our professor patiently listened to all of us, and then she looked at us and said, "Have you ever considered that language is a way to look at reality?" Ooh, that for me was the most intriguing, the most fascinating definition of language I had ever heard. There are moments in life when someone says something that can be life-changing. Have you noticed that? That's part of the power of language. And for me, those words said by my professor were life-changing indeed. It sent my entire linguistic career in a different direction. I was really intrigued by what reality was and by how a language could be seen as a perspective to look at that reality. My professor's words guided my work as a translator, an interpreter, a language teacher, and a transformative communication coach for over 2 decades. And what I have come to understand is that language is not only a way we look at reality, but it's also a way we relate to that reality based on what we see. Let me give you an example. Think of the word bridge. And now, what words would you use to describe a bridge? I'll give you a moment to think about 2 or 3 words to describe a bridge. If you are a speaker of the German language, the words you may use may be elegant, beautiful, connecting. But if you are a speaker of languages like Spanish, French, or Italian, you may describe a bridge by using words like strong, sturdy, imposing. Why is that? Because in German, the word bridge, die Brücke, is a feminine noun, while in Spanish, el puente, in Italian, il ponte, in French, le pont, are all masculine nouns. And because we have been conditioned to talk about females' beauty and about male strength, when you speak to a speaker of languages in which the word bridge is feminine, you will hear people and even architects and engineers describing words that are related to beauty. And you will hear speakers of languages in which the word bridge is masculine describe bridges using words related to strength. You could even say that an Italian bridge design and building team will focus around strength and stability, while a German design and building team will do their best to make sure the bridge looks beautiful and connecting. So, language is a way to look at reality and to relate to that reality based on what we see. Let's look at another example. Some languages look at reality as something we are responsible for, something we create. In these languages, we are the authors of reality. We make things happen. So we say things like, I broke the glass. You make decisions. They open the door. The person doing the action is usually front and center. For other languages, reality is not something we create. Reality is something that exists. And so we interact with what's already there. So instead of saying, I broke the glass, we would say, the glass broke. Instead of you make decisions, we say decisions are taken. Instead of they opened the door opened. Who did this or that is not the point. What matters is what happened. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Alejandra, this is getting too deep into the linguistic weeds. And you're right. It is. I want to take you there on purpose because the language we use is very powerful and you need to know about this tool you have available to you every single day. Language makes and breaks relationships. Language creates peace and leads to wars. Language shapes and destroys whole lives. So now, let me go further with this example of responsibility, because this impacts people's lives in how we assign or don't assign responsibility. In fact, this comes up constantly in the judicial system. When someone speaks a language that sees reality as something that exists rather than as something they create, the charging side may interpret the way of speaking as lacking remorse, refusing to admit guilt, or even evidence that they're hiding something. And then that precious human being can be seen as a liar, a danger to society, and they can receive greater punishment. When I was a certified court interpreter, I had to explain this dynamic again and again and again, because what looked like evasion was simply a different way of relating to reality through language. And here's what makes it even more nuanced. When we are tired, stressed, not feeling well, or emotionally stretched, our brains default to efficiency. And what that means is that they reach for the most deeply established neural pathways. And those are the pathways of our first language. No matter how fluent or proficient we become in a second, third, fifth language, under pressure, our minds go home. And home is always the language we learned first. There's another dimension of this that I find endlessly fascinating. It comes from the work of Robert Kaplan, a linguist from the University of Southern California. Kaplan established that different languages have different thought patterns, different ways of organizing and expressing ideas. And these patterns are shaped by the language and culture we grew up in. English and other languages with similar Indo-European West Germanic roots, like German, Dutch, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, they're very direct languages. If we could draw their thought pattern, it would look like a straight arrow. From point A to point B. The answer first, the reasoning after. Romance languages like Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, they have a different pattern. Not a straight arrow, but a zigzag arrow that moves away from the main point. It explores other territories and then it returns. There is richness in this detour. The detour is part of the point. Now, some languages from the Sino-Tibetan family, like Mandarin, Cantonese, Tibetan, they have a thought pattern that looks more like a circular spiral. The idea is approached from the outside, gradually moving inward toward the heart of what's being communicated. So what does this mean in real life? Well, let's say you're at work and you ask your colleague a very simple question. Are you going to meet next week's deadline? If your colleague's first language is direct and arrow-shaped, you might hear, yes, I'll meet the deadline. That's it. Done. Simple. If your colleague's first language has a zigzag or a spiral thought pattern, and it's also late in the day, they're tired, and maybe they are just recovering from a cold. Remember what happens? Our brains default to what they know best. So your colleague may say something like, next week's deadline. I was thinking about that this morning on my way in, actually, because we also have the new client meeting that week, and I realized I may need to take my middle child to the doctor. We're just hoping he won't need his tonsils removed, but we'll see. It's a busy week, but I already have the main steps outlined, and I'm pretty confident I'll meet the deadline. Whew, same answer. Completely different journey to get there. If you were expecting the straight arrow, the spiral or the zigzag can feel frustrating or evasive or even disrespectful of your time, when in reality, your colleague was simply thinking out loud in the shape of their first language, bringing you fully into their world before arriving at the answer. They were not being evasive or disrespectful. They were being truthful and aligned with their first language thought pattern, even though most likely they're completely unaware. They're following their first language thought pattern. There's one more cultural dimension I want to explore with you today because it comes up constantly in multicultural communication. And that is the question of asking questions, pun intended. In some cultures, particularly those that are more individualistic and less hierarchical, asking questions is not just acceptable, it's expected. It signals engagement, participation, intelligence, and confidence. So if you are part of that culture, you ask your doctor questions. You ask your boss questions. You ask your teachers questions. You ask the person behind the counter a question. This is simply how communication works. But in other cultures that are more hierarchical, more class divided, asking questions, especially of someone who is in a position of authority, can be read very differently. It can feel like a challenge, like a threat to authority, like a sign of disrespect even. I have a friend, an American friend, who moved to Spain, and she is struggling with navigating the medical system there. When she goes to the doctor, she asks lots of questions, the way she always has, and the way she was raised to. People in Spain were reacting in negative ways. They were communicating through their tone of voice and their body language that her questions were not only unwelcomed, but that they felt threatened in their authority. My friend, who's so kind, so polite, and so mindful, was completely bewildered by this because she wasn't trying to challenge anyone. She was just trying to understand her own health. On the other hand, when I worked as a professional interpreter, I regularly educated monolingual English speakers to explicitly tell their Spanish-speaking patients or clients that they welcome their questions, and specifically to say things like, "We expect your questions. Please ask questions," or "I need you to ask questions." Because without that explicit invitation, many people wouldn't ask questions at all. Not because they didn't have any questions, but because they were following their cultural framework of not questioning the person in the white coat, in the uniform, or the suit. And here's something personal I want to share with you. Even now, after more than 25 years living in the United States, after decades of speaking English as a second language and being fluent and proficient, when I go to the doctor, I need to bring a written list of questions in my hand, or else I may not ask any questions at all, even though I know the value of asking questions and the implicit expectation the doctor has that I will be asking questions. The subtle pressure of a medical context still sometimes reaches for the cultural framework of my first language. And that's how deep these patterns go. And this matters for your relationships, because if your first language is less hierarchical and you are in a close relationship with someone whose first language comes from a more hierarchical and class-divided culture, you may feel that they don't care about you because they rarely ask you personal questions. But that may be far from the truth. They care deeply. They're simply following the social rules embedded in their first language. Conversely, if you come from a hierarchical culture and the people in your life ask you direct questions, you may experience them as pushy or intrusive. But they're not. They are following their native social style, expressing care and interest in the way their language taught them to. Now, remember I said at the beginning of this episode that you would have the opportunity to discover something important about yourself? When you hear me say that I help multicultural individuals, couples, and groups, what do you picture? Do you picture someone who migrated from another country? Or someone who grew up speaking 2 languages at home, or whose parents are immigrants, but they grew up in the country their parents migrated to? Okay, yes, that's part of what I mean, but it is not all of what I mean. If there is one thing I'd really love for you to take away from this episode is this: you are a multicultural being and a multicultural speaker. Yes, you listening right now. And every single person you have ever come into contact with, every single person you relate to now and in the future, they are multicultural beings and multicultural speakers. We all are. Each social layer you are a part of is a layer of culture you carry. Your family, your neighborhood, your religion or spiritual background, your socioeconomic class, your profession, the size of the city or small rural town you grew up in, whether you grew up in the dominant social group or a non-dominant one. All of these are layers of culture, and all of them shape how you communicate, and they influence how you use language, how you view reality, and how you relate to reality. Let me give you an example. Imagine 2 neighbors who grew up on the same street. They went to the same school and they became close friends. On the surface, they have so much in common. You may think they have the same culture. But when we take a close look, one of them grew up in a family that has been in the United States for generations. They are Protestant Christians. They played baseball in the street after school. They got their driver's license at 16 and they inherited the family car. They worked at a summer camp. They earned their own money and they had independence that money and transportation could give them. They went to school dances. They went to sporting events. And as adults, they are members of the Rotary Club, just like their parents. The other neighbor, who grew up next door from this first one, grew up as a child of immigrants. Their parents didn't understand baseball. In the country they came from, tennis was the sport that represented status and aspiration. So that's what they played. Religion was present, but not a daily anchor, only mandatory events. Working as a teenager was out of the question because culturally, young people study. They don't work. The conversations about having a car at 16 always ended in arguments. There was no independence in how to dress, which activities to join, where to go, and dating was simply not on the table. Excellence in school and following the family's professional path was the expectation. Same street, same school, close friends, completely different layers of culture. And now that they're both adults, when they need to make a decision like buying a car, it looks different for each of them. The first neighbor does research online, reads reviews, makes a decision, buys a car. The second neighbor calls a family meeting. Everyone has an opinion. Their dad insists they visit the family mechanic. And the car they end up buying may not be the one they wanted, but it's the one that keeps the peace. Neither of these approaches is wrong. They are both the product of the layers of culture each person carries. As you know, I coach multicultural couples with their communication. And when two partners have different multicultural layers, there are many things that we need to work on. I want to share a story from my own coaching practice that illustrates this. I worked with a couple and they were having a big conflict about their apartment, specifically about getting their landlord to make repairs. Both partners grew up in the United States. One grew up in a family with small business owners, and the other in a family that worked in nonprofit, community-based organizations. The partner from the family who were small business owners wanted to contact the landlord immediately and get things fixed right away. Her partner, who came from a community-oriented family, wanted to first build a warm and friendly relationship with the landlord before making any requests. And when they came to work with me, they each had a story about the other. She thought he was avoidant and weak. He thought she was rude and pushy. And neither of them were any of those things. Their communication styles were simply the expression of their different layers of culture, different experiences of authority, of relationship building, of what it means to ask for something, when to ask for it, and how to do it. Once they uncovered all this about themselves and each other, and they understood how their layers of culture were really impacting their communication and their relationship, they were ready to work on finding their value-based, authentic expression that could allow them to make decisions together and support one another. And now let's look at a language alchemy communication tool that is both a personal practice and a relational one. This tool has two steps. The first step is to map your own layers of culture. To do this, you can ask yourself several questions. For example, what's your first language? Is it a direct or indirect communication language? Did you grow up as part of the dominant group in your society or a non-dominant one? Did you have a spiritual or religious background growing up? And how did that shape how you express yourself and how you handle conflicts? Did you grow up in an individualistic family where independence and personal decisions were valued? Or did you grow up in a group-oriented family where decisions involved the collective? And what were the professional backgrounds or industries of the adults who raised you? Did you grow up in a big city, small town, a rural community? All of these layers have shaped your communication style. Once you are able to map your layers of culture, you can take the second step. And that is to have this kind of conversation with the most important people in your life. You can help them map their own layers of culture, and then together you can look at past misunderstandings, arguments, or moments of frustrations you experienced together. And then you can see how your multicultural layers influenced your communication. This is when you get to discover that those moments were not about bad intentions, that they were the confluence of different multicultural communication layers. Now, remember, awareness is always the first step of language alchemy. You cannot transform what you cannot see. So once you can see it, you can begin to choose differently. And this choice needs to be anchored in the understanding that no communication style is better than another. They're different. They're shaped by different histories, different ways of looking at the world, and different ways of relating to that world, that reality. When you can hold that truth, when you can meet someone's communication style with curiosity instead of judgment, you are creating the conditions for real belonging for both of you. And now, let's recap what you've heard in this episode. Today, we talked about how language is a way to look at reality and to relate to the reality we see. We explored how some languages place the person at the center of every action, while others place the event at the center, and how this difference can have serious consequences, like in a court of law. We also talked about Robert Kaplan's linguistic thought patterns and how these patterns show up in something as everyday, like answering questions about a work deadline. Then we talked about how asking questions is itself culturally shaped, welcomed and expected in some cultures, and perceived as a challenge to authority in others. We also explored the idea that you are a multicultural being and a multicultural speaker, shaped by every layer of culture you have lived and that you're currently living. And that mapping those layers for yourself and for the people you love is the beginning of a deeper understanding and an opportunity for belonging for you and others. Thank you for being here for this third episode of the Multicultural Communication and Belonging series. In our next episode, we are going to explore language that pushes people out. We are going to talk about how xenophobic words and phrases show up in everyday conversations, often without the speaker realizing it, and what we can choose to say instead. Until next episode, and as we say in Argentina, ciao ciao! Original music by Gary Lapo. You can find all links in the show notes at languagealchemy.com.